Mr. Franklin. My name is April Grayson, and today is March 19, 2019, and we are in the offices of North Mississippi Rural Legal Services in Oxford, Mississippi, and I'll be interviewing Mr. Clarence Franklin today. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
In the room with us are Caleb Hall, Ryan Parrish, Justin Gary, Jenny Kilgore, Dylan McCullough, Morgan Cuterini, and Attorney Ben Cole. Okay, Mr. Franklin, can you just start off by telling me your full name and your date of birth, please?
Clarence Franklin. My date of birth is 7/3/52.
And where were you born?
Centerville, Mississippi.
And is that where you grew up as well?
Yes.
Centerville. Can you tell me a little bit about your family in Centerville and your growing up there? A little bit about your parents and siblings or grandparents or anything?
Okay. I grew up in Centerville, Mississippi, in Wilkinson County, which was at that time one of the more segregated counties in the state of Mississippi. I went to the Wilkinson County Training School at that time for 3.5 years. I did not graduate from there because supposedly we were being integrated in 1970. So I came to the William Winan School, which was in Centerville at the time. But, of course, there was no integration. None of the white students came. They started a academy. They started an academy. And that system is still not integrated, even today. Right. And as for my parents, my mother was a stay-at-home mom, but she was also a seamstress and she was a cook. She could, people would bring her pictures in a catalog and she would measure them and she could make dresses by that. My father was a public worker who worked mostly out of Baton Rouge, and both of them basically could do anything. By the time I didn't even realize there was such a thing as a repairman until I was grown, because if something broke, they fixed it. So let's see what else.
Could you tell me their names?
James Franklin and Mary Franklin. Right. And we lived in an old antebellum style house that basically the owner just said, you all can live there as long as you take care of it. And so that's where I grew up, and until I came to school at Ole Miss in 1970. And then we moved into a house of our own in 72, I believe it was. But of course, all of my memories of growing up is in that house.
That's fascinating. Can you tell me what that was like, living in that kind of house?
Oh, I mean, it was, well, it was what I saw as normal. I didn't know anything else. So that's what I grew up with. And basically, there was no electricity upstairs in that house, but it was downstairs. And by the time I got to high school and wanted a room of my own, I had to basically run electricity myself to one of the rooms upstairs to create a room for myself. We didn't actually live upstairs until that point. Lots of people thought that the upstairs part of the house was haunted. Of course, I never saw or heard anything when I was up there, even though when people would come home and would live in my room, they said they heard all kinds of things. I never heard anything. But that was it. I graduated in 1970, and I was the valedictorian of my class. I spent a lot of time because I have a lot of sisters in New Orleans. I spent a lot of time in the summertime in New Orleans, so I would go and work. Nice place to visit. I knew the city very well, but never really wanted to stay there. And so when I came to Ole Miss, I liked Oxford. A small town, which is basically what I grew up with, but because of the college, it had a lot of things going for it that most small towns would not have. And so basically, I never left. I have been here since 1970.
And just going back a little bit about the house. Was it a house that had a name?
I think it was called, well, it was owned by the Huffs. So I guess you could say it was the Huff House. It was up on a hill, and it was 2-story house with porch going all the way across on 2 levels, upstairs and downstairs.
Thank you. So after you graduated from the university, what did you do at that point?
Different jobs. I graduated with a major in law enforcement and sociology. It was only after graduating that I realized that I did not want to work in law enforcement at all. And I did different odd jobs here and there until getting a job at Legal Services in 1980. And so I've been here since then.
Can you tell me about that what drew you to working here and about the very beginnings of your time here?
Well, what drew me here? Well, let's just say I was working in a factory at the time, and I was looking for something better than that. And so when I came here to Legal Services, they had it was a supply clerk's job. And basically I was in charge of taking care of the supplies. We had 12 offices at that time, so I was taking care of the supplies in all 12 of those offices. And we got into a whole lot of stuff once Jesse Pennington was the person who hired me. He was the deputy director at the time. Once they learned that I could do things like draw and design different stuffs, they started putting all of that into my job description, so that eventually the job grew to basically operations manager. At that time, I worked under John Buffington, who was the operations manager, and and Pearlie Waddlington was his administrative assistant. So I was the person. They were the managers. I was the person who, for lack of a better way of putting it, did most of the work. But eventually, when things started shutting down, when Reagan was in office and started cutting LSC, I eventually became the operations manager myself. The difference was when John was operations manager, he had Pearlie and me. When I was became operations manager, I had me. So I still had to do everything. And eventually that grew into, after we got into computers and all of that kind of stuff, it grew into me becoming the statewide network administrator, and also maintained most of my operations manager's duties, which basically included everything short of legal work to keep the program going. I took care of leases, office leases, supplies, the computers, all of that stuff, and still do all of that.
And what is your title now?
It is Network Administrator, Operations Manager. And by the Network Administrator part, that covers both programs in the state. The technology part, I take care of both of the programs in the state.
And can you explain a little bit about what you mean by both programs?
Well, North Mississippi Rural Legal Services and Mississippi Center for Legal Services are the 2 legal services programs in the state. Initially, when we combined, let me back up a little bit on how I got to that position. We applied for a grant in the early 2000s, and the initial grant that we got was, it wasn't the infrastructure grant. It was it was a grant that allowed us to combine our databases. What we were doing, we were using Kemp's database, but what we were doing is that each office had their own separate database, and they weren't combined until we got ready to do reports. And the way they would be combined is that you would have to bring the information here, and you would combine them all. We got what was at that time called an ASP grant, which initially was supposed to have allowed us to take part in Kemp's, John Kemp. He's the one who does our it's his software that we use for clients, for case management. We were supposed to have gotten on his ASP, which was located somewhere else. But for the $50,000 that initial grant gave us, we got the idea to, let's just see if we can do this on our own. We started working with a local company out of Batesville called Complete Computers. And we not only got the clients where everybody had access to it and it was a live database, we also got Outlook, email, and WordPerfect and clients, and eventually even our accounting system was hosted that way. And basically it was for the same amount of money per month that Kemp was charging for just clients. Then the next year we got a $100,000 grant, which we were supposed to design a statewide website. I had already designed a website for NMRLS, so it was just a matter of putting together a website for all the programs in the state. At that time, it was 5 programs, I believe, and so I designed the website. But then Pro Bono Net came along with a template for a statewide website. And so a year later, we moved all of our stuff to that. Then after that, we got a $500,000 infrastructure grant, which allowed us to combine the whole state so that in a sense we have a central intake system using the same infrastructure. We have all the programs now have that ASP like we did, where they have the same information, where everything is on each person's desktop. So, you don't have to worry about any of the backups because that's taken care of at the hub site at Complete Computers or anything like that. It's just, as long as it's working, everybody's happy. Also included with that was the statewide intake system, which both programs use using one number that is geophysically routed so that it goes to the right program. Initially, like I said, we had the 5 programs, but we now only have 2. And none of those programs were ever combining their stuff. We at least did ours once a month. Our database, we combined once a month. They were never doing it. So basically, we had to go from office to office, collect the database, and because in clients you have different staff numbers, different ways of doing your case numbering and all that kind of stuff, we had to come up with a way to do all of this. And it's interesting because we would collect the database in one place, and then on a laptop in the car, going to the next place, we would make all the necessary changes that we had to make so that by the time we got the last database, we were able to put it all together in one database without conflicts. A lot of the programs had funding source numbers that were the same, or they had staff numbers that were the same. So we had to sit down and figure out how to change that so that it didn't mess with the data that anybody had, so that everybody still kept all of that data. And one of the interesting things about that is that when we were putting the infrastructure grant together, let me just say this. This was like Gulfport. That was actually Pascagoula initially, but it's Gulfport now. Hattiesburg, Meridian, Laurel was even one of the offices then. Some of those offices have been closed. Jackson, Macomb, Natchez, and Vicksburg. At that time, which was really interesting, we had the company, Complete Computers, that was the host site for all of this, had their own plane, which made this really, really interesting because where, let's just say we're going to Gulfport to do a job, it takes you a day basically to drive to Gulfport and a day to come back. But because of the plane, we were able to leave at 7 o'clock in the morning, get all our work done, and be back at 7 o'clock at night. I missed that too. I enjoyed that. It was a lot more fun doing that than it was driving all these distances. And so that's kind of where we are. We started off, when we set up our stuff remotely like that, I didn't realize it at the time, but basically we had the cloud long before anybody else was even thinking about a cloud. And so, because basically that's all the cloud is, your information easily accessed through the internet and located somewhere else. off site. And so we had that before other folks did. And it the system has grown over the years where it's basically the same system, but because technology changed and because of, I think we started off with DSL, and now we have fiber connections in all of our offices. So it has grown, and we're still working on things to make it grow and to make it even better.
You used the term ASP earlier.
Right.
What does that stand for?
Well, specifically, I can't tell you exactly what it stands for, but what it is it is a way of having your information on each person's desktop. Each person had they had the case management, they had the email, they had Office, they had WordPerfect on each person's desktop.
Great. So it sounds like you are one of the main people who has kept everything running so that all the other work could go on over the years. Did you have an opportunity? Have you had an opportunity over the years to get to know a lot of the attorneys working in different spaces and different offices, as well as some of the clients and community members?
Well, in terms of the people in the offices, as a technology person, I'm probably one of the few people who actually do know all the folks in all the offices, because for the most part, most folks don't have any reason to go to any other offices. So yes, I do. In terms of clients, I don't do anything related to clients, except a few years ago, I was putting together a brochure for legal services. And in so doing, I needed some testimony from some clients. So I actually went out and I met with several clients. And, one of the things about what I do is that I'm doing everything necessary so that everybody else can do their job, but I never get to see the end product of what is actually being done. And so I actually enjoyed that as I sat there and listened to those folks talk about what legal services had done for them, because they were all very happy that legal services was there when they had their problems. So yeah, that was fulfilling. I'll put it that way, because you can just work, but you don't really see what you're doing. You only see all you know is what you're doing, and you know that they are doing what they're supposed to be doing, but you don't hear about it until you actually get a chance to go out and talk to some clients.
Do you remember some of the stories they shared with you?
Yeah, not really. Not really. They all basically talked about how happy they were that legal services was there, because I think in some cases there were people who, a little bit I might remember, people who were about to lose everything, and then legal services came to their rescue. There was one elderly lady who had gotten mixed up with, I think it was Medicare or something like that, where they were charging her an awful lot of money, and legal services came to her rescue and helped her. So it was nice just to be able to talk to these folks and see the results of what my work was setting up for them to do, so to speak. Yeah.
And thinking about your time working with colleagues at Legal Services, are there particular people that were really influential over your time here?
I guess in the beginning it was Jesse Pennington. One of the reasons being when we first had to do our reduction in force, he was the person, that was another person who was a clerk at the time, but it was totally different clerks in what we did. And obviously that person had more seniority than I did, and I think what Wilhelm, who was the executive director at the time, Wilhelm Joseph, they were basically going by who had been there the longest for the most part. But it was Jesse Pennington who spoke up for me because he saw the potential of what I could bring to the program more so. So that got me here. One of the interesting things, too, about those early days at Legal Services, when I was first here, Ben Cole was the litigation director. Wilhelm Joseph was the executive director. Jesse Pennington was the deputy director, and John Buffington was the operations manager. we had a lot of staff meetings back in those days. Whenever important decisions came about that had to be done, we always had a meeting so that the staff could feel like they were a part of the decision making process. What was interesting that I found out is that when they were doing all of their meetings, they had me video recording those meetings. And so I learned after a period of time that they all worked very well together. Now they were kind of master manipulators at getting, they would have already decided what they wanted to do, but they made the staff feel like they were part of the process. And it's very important because staff wants to feel like they're part of whatever the decisions are that's being made. It was I who found out because they had me recording it. I found out that wasn't really the case and that they had already made it. But it was important though, because they still wanted to feel like they were a part. And that kind of bothered me a little bit because then I knew, but I couldn't really tell anybody. I used to be one of the outspoken people in the initial days. And then once I found that out, I said, oh, well, I just sat back and just listened, because at that point, what was the point? Because they would have already have decided. But I give them credit for that. It was good from a management point of view, because you made the whole staff feel like they were part of the decisions. And in some cases, they were part of it, but the major stuff would have already been decided by the time we had the meetings. But they were very good at that.
Thank you. So could you talk a little bit, you've referenced the funding structure and you referenced when President Reagan came into office. Can you talk a little bit more about how things evolved with the decreased funding over the years?
Well, when I first started working here, we had no computers. Everything was manually done. And as funds were cut, we slowly started getting into computers to make it more feasible to continue to doing the work that we were doing. One of the things that has always bothered me as far as the Reagan administration goes is the fact that once you start something in Congress, whether it makes any sense or not, it just continues forever. And so because he was trying to get rid of legal services, even though we've had Democratic presidents in office since then, nobody stopped to say, we need to stop this because legal services is a necessary thing. And so literally we're fighting to keep our funding year after year, even though the National Bar Association and everybody else agrees that legal services is necessary. It's just that once something starts in Congress, it just keeps going. There's no stopping it.
And so what other impacts to like the day-to-day operations here at Legal Services did you see that funding shift?
Well, the number of people, first of all, because we went down, and the number of offices. We went down from, like I said, we had 12 offices at one time. Now we only have 4. And that was one of the biggest things. And we have a lot less people. Unfortunately, you have to maintain a certain level of attorneys to be functional. We lost a lot of good support staff people during those times. And, that was one of the things. One of the things that kind of helped me when I was here working with legal services is that from like 83 to 2000, I was the editor of a local magazine called the Oxford Development Association Soul Force. And the beauty of working here was that I literally had the license to say whatever I wanted to, and I didn't have to worry about my job being attacked. And I wrote a whole lot of things down through the years, and I didn't really realize that people were paying attention to what I was writing until in the early 90s when we invaded Iraq for the first time. And I did an article about the real reasons that we were there, and the fact that I didn't see where oil should cost any of Americans' lives. And the very next day after we came out, the Oxford Eagle quoted me. And so I said, uh-oh. Then I started paying a little bit more attention. Once you know that people are paying attention. Even when I was a student at Ole Miss, we had I had a radio station called Black Segment in the early 70s, which I don't know whether anybody was listening to, but if it was, nobody was saying anything, but it's probably a good thing that they wasn't, because basically we attacked everything on that radio show. But I had the freedom to just do whatever, if I wanted to write about something, I didn't have to worry about my job, which is what a lot of folks didn't speak up about because they did. And I basically stopped in 1970. I did not realize that one of the real motivations for me continuing to do that was a lady by the name of Miss Della Davidson. She was the president of the ODA at the time. And when I came on board in 83, the Oxford Development Association had been a really big thing in the late 60s and early 70s. But by the time I came along in 83, it was dying. And so with the revival of the Soul Force, the whole organization revived. I realized that. I didn't realize I don't know whether they all realized that, but I did. And because it was so important to Miss Davidson, I just did it automatically. But then when she died, what I had been enjoying all those years actually became work. And sometimes I did it for 2 years after she died, and then I just didn't really have it anymore. And I figured it was better to try to let someone else do it. At the time, I didn't think anybody else would do it, but I was hoping somebody else would do it. But they didn't. It died within a year. The magazine did. And even though the organization still exists, it just exists in name only. It's nothing like it was. It's not the little vibrant thing that it once was. We did all kinds of things with while we were doing the Soul Force. We did 10 years of recognition programs where we recognized some of the important people in the community. Our first one, we actually recognized Miss Davidson, who was the principal of the school system, and we brought in speakers like the state, for that first one, the state president of the National Negro Council for Women was our first speaker. We even had Charles Tisdale, who was the editor of the Jackson Advocate, to speak one year. And so we had our group of speakers and stuff, and the program flourished. It made money year after year after year, to the point that those programs took care of the Soul Force itself, where the ODA didn't have to spend anything on it. It actually paid for itself. But, all things has to come to an end at some point. And I recall in 2000, when I stopped doing it, I remember thinking about this on 9/11 when the towers were hit. Now, I was aware of things like how the president had been told that this was a possibility for years and how they didn't do anything about it. And of course, if I had still been doing the Soul Force, I would have had to write that. But I was kind of glad that I didn't, for the simple reason that I was sitting there the night when this happened, and I was listening to President Bush, and I'm listening to all these people cheering for him, but all I heard him saying was that all these little freedoms that you all have come to know are gone. It made me think about this Star Wars movie where he said, this is how freedom ends, or something like that, with a round of applause that's what I heard. And I'm saying to myself, if I was still doing the Soul Force, I would have to write about it. And who knows what could have happened, because journalists and everybody else got in all kinds of trouble after that because of the Patriot Act. I would have had to write about that too, because that's just, you have to tell people what you know if you're in the business of journalism, so to speak. But
could you contextualize the ODA and Soul Force a little bit in terms of Oxford? Did it serve a particular community, and what was the audience?
Okay, it was the audience was the Black community. It started in the late '60s, at the height of the Civil Rights Movement. Reverend Wayne Johnson was the person who started it at the time. It had it included a daycare center, it included a library, it included a co-op store, all kinds of things. As a matter of fact, it actually owned a building it rented a building called the Black House. You know that black building across the street from Second Baptist there? And it it was the voice, so to speak. There was a soul force even back in those days. They did a soul force, but the soul force then was mimeograph sheets of paper, legal sheets of paper. When I came on board, I redesigned it into a magazine format, which was still legal paper but folded over, and did it as a magazine. And they also had a black house, which brings up another story. uh, one summer, the students on campus, the black students, needed a place where they can go to do things of their own. And Wayne Johnson, they allowed me to take over the black house just for the students. And what we did one summer was that we went in and we designed. The building had a counter in it. We painted the counter red, black, and green. We painted all the walls black, and then we got some sheetrock and placed it around the walls in the building. And I drew some paintings on that sheetrock from a children's book called Kulami the Brave, which I found a few years ago and bought it once I saw it on Amazon. But it was some of the best painting probably that I had ever done. And so that was our place. We had that where we can go have our parties on the weekends or whatever. And I mean, it flourished for a whole year. But the co-op store was what was paying rent. And that next summer when I wasn't there, they had to let it go. But, it was something that I really enjoyed that year. The ODA, that's where they held their meetings and things. And so the ODA went through Wayne Johnson when they needed to use the building. But if any students needed to use the building, they had to go through me. And this was at the time when the fraternities and things were on campus. They didn't have buildings of their own then, and they wanted to have control of something. And so they actually got up in the Black Student Union meeting and said that they wanted to vote on who controlled the Black House. And I basically told them, look, I have an agreement with Wayne Johnson and the ODA that you all have to go through me. Now, you can vote on whatever you want to, but you're going to still have to go through me. I didn't get along with them too well in those early days because of that.
What year was that?
That was 74, 73 to 74.
Thank you. That's rich history.
Mm-hmm.
And were there direct ties between legal services and ODA?
A lot of the legal services lawyers wrote articles. Leonard McClellan wrote a regular article called Legally Speaking. Catherine Kilgore even took over Legally Speaking at one time. Alvin Chambliss wrote several articles through the years too. He kept us informed with what was going on with the Ayers case and with the legal community here in Oxford. So yeah, it had its connections to legal services also.
Great. Thank you so much. So you have a lot of ties to the community, obviously, and I wondered if you could reflect a little bit about the importance of community voices, specifically in NMRLS's work, and how they have community workers and community board members. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Well, like I said, haven't worked directly with clients or anything, but I am aware that in the early days of legal services, the community workers who ultimately became the paralegals were actually possibly even more well known in the community than the attorneys were, because they were the ones who went out and brought the community to legal services. They were the ones who informed them that legal services actually was here. Because in a lot of cases, a lot of times people would have their legal problems, and didn't know that they had somewhere where they could go. And so that's where the community workers and legal services came in. I sent a few people here myself through the years. All right.
And did you see, were you, I don't know if you had this context, but were you able to reflect on how that was unique to legal services to have such a important community voice in the work here?
Well, we didn't know of anything else like it. So, in that sense, yes, it was definitely unique because there wasn't anything else like that. And back to Wayne Johnson and the ODA. Wayne Johnson was at one time, was chairman of the board of legal services. So there was a connection between the Oxford Development Association and legal services also.
And what was he like? Could you tell me a bit about him?
Wayne was a very interesting person. He didn't go in for a lot of hoopla. He only saw practical things, and he wanted to do practical things for people. You know, he wasn't a person who talked about doing anything. He was the kind of person who actually did things. As a matter of fact, I bought my first car from him. Wayne Johnson was the kind of person who would get a car. He would just drive the car. When the car stopped, he'd get another car. And so he had this one car that he said that just kept overheating on him. And he had actually spent money on trying to repair the overheating. He had replaced the thermostat and all that stuff, and it still overheated. And he actually sold me that car for $125 and told me that if you can't fix it now, I could get my money back. But I bought the car with the belief that if I replaced the radiator, it would work. So I drove that car until it got hit for like 6-7 years after that, because it never overheated again. And it was a good car too, because when my wife and I first got married, we were living in CB Webb initially. And, we had all those folks out there shining up their pretty cars every day, it seemed. My car was kind of an older car that had come from up north somewhere where it was kind of rusty at the bottom. And the strange thing about it, though, when wintertime came, most of those folks were knocking on my door because my car was the one that always started. So it was a good car. It lasted a long time until it was hit in an accident. And even after that, my father-in-law took the engine out of it and put it in another car. Yeah. But back to Wayne. Wayne only saw practical things. He saw how he could do something for people and how he could use things like that. And so we get back to the Black House again. When they had to give up the Black House, like I said, I was never much of I drew a lot. I didn't paint a whole lot, but those were some of the better paintings that I had ever done. At that time, my painting teacher, who I was taking a class that summer, actually lived across the street. And so I brought him over. He gave me ideas on how to improve it, and I actually got an A out of that class. He gave me credit for what I was doing there. But when they had to give up the Black House, they saw sheetrock. They didn't see the paintings. They only saw sheetrock. And when I came back to school and found out that they had actually given it up, I said, well, what happened to my paintings? And Rivers Hills Funeral Home at the time was something that Wayne was working with, and they had used my paintings to sheetrock the building. And then he said, we couldn't get paint. Paint wouldn't take on that stuff. That really hurt me. I wish it was like today where you have cameras where you can take pictures of everything, because I have no record.
So there's no documentation.
No documentation of those pictures and no pictures of them, because like I said, I am a person who drew mostly. I have never painted that much until then, and I really like that. I would have loved to at least had pictures of it so I could show somebody. That was why when I found the little book, Kulami the Brave, I bought it, because that does give me some memories of that. But that was how he did things. He saw sheetrock, and he could use sheetrock. The paintings never occurred to him.
Great. What were some of the images that in the paintings?
It was there was it was a war party, one of them, and then there was one with it was the story of a young brave that started out young, and then he was growing up, and he, in the end of the story, he got married. The one that was on the back wall was the wedding scene, and the ones along the way was just some of the daily life things. It was like 4 paintings in all, and the wedding scene on the back wall was the best one. That was the one that my teacher told me that I needed to flesh it out a little bit more, that it was a little too flat. And so that was kind of what it was. Mm-hmm.
Great, thank you so much. Um, well, were there other people during your time here that really stood out as personalities that you might share a little bit about?
Well, most of the people that I dealt with in the ODA, for one thing, and really most of the people that we dealt with at Legal Services too. Like I said, Wilhelm Joseph was the director when I first started working, and down through the years, we went through many different people. And Ben was here in the early days, but then he left. He left for what about 20 years, I believe, at another program, and then he came back. And so there were people like Ava Jackson, Solomon Osborne, Willie Perkins, and both Perkins and Osborne are now in the Mississippi legislature. And I think Mary Brown is a judge, and Ava actually works for the what is it that Ava works for? The U.S. Attorney's Office, right? And so, yeah, there's been some very influential people. And then there was all those people in the ODA, too. Like Miss Davidson was one, but then there was Miss Susie Marshall, Mr. Fred Crockett, Reverend Arthur Herod. It was kind of like a who's who of the black community that was part of all of those different things. And my wife and I kind of got in with all of those people and got the respect of all of those people. And so, you know, we really enjoyed it. Both of us grew up in families with grandparents and stuff. And so we felt a closeness to those people. And like I said, the reason I kept doing the Soul Force all those years was because of them. But when they slowly started dying, then something that had become a labor of love became work. And, you know, once you don't enjoy it anymore, you need to give it up. Give it up.
Well, so you've talked a good bit about some of the projects you worked on here, but what do you think are maybe the most important one or two projects that you've worked on during your time here?
Probably that technology thing. Once we got into that, I think that would probably be the most important thing, because, you know, we went from no computers to having a complete statewide networked system during those years. So I think that was probably the most important thing.
Could you sort of summarize the impact that working here in particular has had on your life?
This month will be 39 years. That's a long time. And so it has become a part of my life in all of that time. As far as impact, like I said, the mere fact that I was working here gave me the freedom to do all of those other things that I enjoyed doing. And even after I stopped doing the Soul Force, I guess editing must have been in me, because then I started doing a newsletter called the Jacob's Ladder for my church, which I've been doing since 2000. So, yeah. But legal services gave, I guess because I wasn't working with the clients directly, and because there was a need for other things other than lawyers and the people who actually did work directly with the clients, I had an opportunity to do a lot of stuff that I actually like doing and enjoy. And all those little things that it takes to literally hold the whole system up. But I enjoy doing that, and I like that. So it's been an important part of my life, absolutely.
Well, before we wrap up, is there anything else that we haven't covered that you want to share about your time here?
Well, yes, this is totally unrelated to legal services, but when I was in high school, I wrote stories. I created a group of characters called the Space Travelers. And I guess you could call it autobiographical science fiction, since I was one of the characters. And I actually wrote several stories in high school. And last year, I found the one comic book that I had written and drawn, and I never actually finished coloring all of it. So what I did was I scanned it and colored it digitally with Photoshop, redid the lettering and everything, and basically gave out copies of it to everybody here for Christmas. And it was very well received. Everybody liked the story, the characters, and everything, to the point that I went back and I looked at one of the two books that had survived since 1970, called For the Sake of a Friend. And I decided to, okay, let me just see what I can do about rewriting this story. And even though the story was actually written in 1970, it was written at a time in Southwest Mississippi where race was definitely a problem. And even though my story is not about race, there's clearly some commentary throughout the story. I started rewriting the book because, well, let's just say when I was in high school, I wasn't what you'd consider a really good writer, but I was a good storyteller. So I started rewriting the book, and I started in like January, and I finished around May, June, or something like that. And then I worked at trying to see if I could get it published. I had a few people here actually read the original manuscript, and I don't know if you know Ron Rishlack and Claire, his wife. They were two of the people who read the early manuscript, and they all liked it. And so I started trying to get it, looking at the possibility of trying to get it published. And I talked to Neil White eventually, who told me about Amazon's Create Space. And so that's where I went to try to get the book published. So now the book is actually available on Amazon. And there's a Kindle version and a paperback version, which I would encourage you all to go read. I think you'll enjoy it. It's still from the point of view of a 1970s high schooler, but it covered a lot of things. I think you'll find it interesting.
Great. Well, thank you so much.
Oh, you're welcome.
It's been such a pleasure to talk to you today. Appreciate it.
You're quite welcome.